Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Game Core. Today we're going to check out a new clamshell handheld. This is the AYANEO Flip 1S. So this is a handheld PC, but kind of shaped like a big old 3DS. Now this is not the first dual screen clamshell handheld PC that they have created. In fact, last year they had a very similar one called the Flip DS. And this new one has been upgraded in just about every single way. It's got a much bigger screen on the bottom, it's got improved controls, and it also has a more powerful chipset. And it is a very interesting PC to work with because those dual screens do open up a lot of possibilities. Now, for me as a retro gamer, I've mostly been using it to play like dual screen games, things like 3DS, regular DS, and Wii U, but there are a lot of other things you can do with it as well. When it comes down to it, this really is just a handheld PC that happens to have two monitors attached to it at once, and there are some pretty clever ways that you can use that second screen if you would like. You can use it just to, monitor the statistics if you would like. That's kind of the default setting, but you could do plenty of other things as well, and we will explore that in this video. The main question of this handheld is how much do you want a dual screen setup, and how much are you willing to pay for something like this? Because I think without question, this thing is a lot of fun, and I think anyone who picks it up is going to love it. But the cheapest that you can find this device right now is $1,300 early bird pricing, and the company has already announced a cheaper model that looks to be a little bit better for retro gaming anyway. You're probably thinking we've got a lot to discuss, and you're right, so grab your favorite snack and drink, let's go ahead and get started. Okay, let's start by talking about specs, and then we will move on to this insane price point. Now, initially they were offering two different CPU options, the Ryzen 8840U and then the new HX 370. And the 8840U model has been out for a couple years, and that was actually going to be the one that I would recommend for anyone watching this video just because it's a lot cheaper. The starting price for that model was $800. However, the pre-order campaign has been up for a couple weeks now, and they actually pulled all of the 8840U listings. They said that they were having a shortage when it came to motherboards, and so I'm not sure if it's going to pop up again, but as it stands right now, the HX 370 is the only one listed. And this one comes at a much higher price. It starts at $1,300, and we'll talk about that more in a moment. Now, like with a lot of the other AYANEO models, there are a bunch of options available. So RAM will start at 16 gigabytes and go all the way up to 64, and same thing with internal storage. They're going to go between 1 and 2 terabytes depending on the model you pick up. Now, the AYANEO Flip line actually has two different versions. There's one with a keyboard on the bottom and then one with a dual screen. We're going to be looking at the dual screen, and so that's what I'm going to focus on in this video. So let's talk about each of these screens, starting with the top one. This one is 7 inches with a resolution of 1920 by 1080. This one is also OLED and has a 144 Hz refresh rate, very similar to the one that they had previously on the original Flip DS. It is worth noting that the top screen is not a variable refresh rate display. On the bottom, we've got a much bigger screen than previously. This one is now 4.5 inches and with a resolution of 1620 by 1080. That is a 3:2 aspect ratio. This bottom one is an LCD panel and it runs at 60 Hz. It also has a 45 watt-hour battery, which is kind of small by today's handheld PC standards, but it still has a lot of weight to it. It's 655 grams, or a little bit under 1.5 pounds. As far as connectivity, we've got the works Wi-Fi 7, Bluetooth 5.3, and it also has dual USB 4 ports with 40 gigabit per second transfer speeds. It's also running Windows 11 and has some other fancy components like TMR joysticks as well as Hall effect sensor triggers. Now, like with other AYANEO handhelds, this one is starting on Indiegogo, then it'll shift over to their website at a higher price later. We still got over a month before the campaign ends, and you can see there's about 300 people who have already bought off on one. And like I mentioned before, the 8840U models are not showing up right now. I'm not sure if they will be popping up later or not. In general, you're going to see two different price points depending on whether or not you get the keyboard or the dual screen model, and the dual screen model is always $20 more expensive. And so the cheapest DS is going to be $1,300, and it comes with 32 gigs of RAM, a terabyte of storage, and in the black color. If you want to get a fancy yellow one like I have to review, this one is going to retail for $1,400. That'll come with 32 gigs of RAM and 2 terabytes of storage. And from there, the price will go all the way up to nearly $1,600, and that'll give you 64 gigabytes of RAM with your 2 terabytes of storage. I'm not really sure that 64 gigabytes of RAM is going to be of any benefit when it comes to gaming over 32. And so this has been a pretty weird launch for me just in terms of the experience over the past couple weeks, where initially I was like, all right, I can totally see the $800 option being viable. And then they took that away. And so now this is a $1,300 mini PC, which does kind of change that paradigm significantly. Now, if you're watching this in the future and we do have cheaper options available, then that's something to keep in mind. But I'm going to have to review this as it is with the price points that I have to work with. Another thing that makes this launch really strange is that in the middle of everything, they announced another dual screen handheld that looks awfully familiar to the one we're looking at today. This one is called the AYANEO Pocket DS, and it's not up for sale just yet, but it seems to be coming very soon. This one is Android based and actually has some improvements over the one that I'm looking at here today. For example, the top screen is going to have a higher refresh rate of 165 Hz, in addition to still being 7 inches 1080p and OLED. On top of that, the bottom screen is larger. Instead of being 4.5 inches, it's 5 inches, and it's also 4:3 aspect ratio, which is going to be a better fit for systems like DS and 3DS. It's also running the Snapdragon G3X Gen 2, which we've seen in a bunch of other handhelds from this company over the past couple years. It's a powerful processor. It's like the Snapdragon 8 Gen 2, but it's not that expensive either. I would expect this handheld to be somewhere around like the $400 to $600 price range. So I think if you're more budget minded and you don't mind dealing with the Android ecosystem over something like a Windows PC, then this might be a better option. And so it almost feels like the Pocket DS is undercutting the Flip 1S that I'm reviewing here today, just because it's a lot cheaper and can do many similar things when it comes to dual screen gaming. So what I'm going to do in this video is really just focus on the Windows experience, things that you can do on this handheld you won't be able to do on Android as easily. Things like, playing PC games, but then also, some of the fun things you can do with Wii U, 3DS, and Nintendo DS as well. So let's take a look at the handheld, and this was a review unit sent over to me from AYANEO. Like with all my videos, all opinions are my own. They're not going to see this video ahead of time, and no money was exchanged in any way. Now, my first impression with this handheld is that it is gorgeous. I love this yellow on black option. Now, you will have to pay a little bit more to get this yellow option compared to the solid black one, but man, this thing is beautiful. My next big impression was that we have a much bigger screen down below compared to the first one. In fact, let me grab the first one so you can see. Okay, so here is the first AYANEO Flip DS, and you can see that this one had a much smaller screen. It was a 3:2 aspect ratio like this one, but it had, I believe, only a 480p resolution, so it wasn't that great to work with, whereas this one, much bigger, 4.5 inches. This new one also feels a little bit busier, and I think it's because we have limited space around the screen and every single space has a button. Like, it feels like, there's just so much going on here, but honestly, all these same buttons are actually here on the original one as well. They just seem more because we have it in this other layout. My next big impression is that it feels really solid in the hands, like well made and everything, but it's also got a lot of heft and weight to it. It weighs 655 grams, which is just a couple grams heavier than the original. And that makes it about 20 grams heavier than the Steam Deck, but a lot more compact in size overall. And so I wouldn't say that this is like overly heavy, like it just feels really solid and dense, which I think is a good thing. And, another nice thing about it is that it's very bottom heavy. Some other like flip handhelds will have a lot of weight at the top. This one does not. And so it feels nice and well balanced in the hand. So if you're one of those people who think the Steam Deck is too heavy, then this is definitely going to be too much, especially because it's so compact and dense compared to like the Steam Deck, which is wider. I think that the Steam Deck's weight is a little bit better distributed. So yes, long story short, this thing is pretty massive, even compared to things like, the new Nintendo 2DS XL or my DSi XL or the Retroid Pocket Flip 2. I should also note that even though it feels very compact as a PC handheld, it's still not something I would consider to be pocketable. Now, I've got some really big pockets on these shorts right here, but still, for the most part, I would say this is something you're more likely to chuck in a bag. And that is one of the benefits of having a clamshell is that, these two screens are going to be protected when you close it up. Now, this is also a $1,300 plus investment, so I almost feel like it needs its own case on top of the fact that it's a clamshell, just because I don't want it to get beat up and scratched and everything else. So now let's talk about how it feels to play it in terms of controls as well as ergonomics. Let's start with some context. So the original Flip DS had these really clicky and shallow controls. In fact, you can barely see it peeking out over the shell, and you can see there just is no travel to them. They're very shallow. Same thing with the face buttons. They're just very flat against the shell. It's almost flush. And that was one of my least favorite things about these controls is that you don't get a lot of feedback when you're pressing down on them just because it's basically like a single layer. Now the new buttons have that same kind of clicky, flat feeling, but they are a lot more elevated, and I think it's a really good move. So I really like the feel of this D-pad. It is very clicky. Same thing with these face buttons. They're clicky, but you can see they stick out quite a bit, and so I've really been enjoying just using these buttons compared to the old one. If I was to guess, I would say these are probably dome switches or maybe covered micro switches, but either way, they are very soft click. They feel very good. The D-pad itself doesn't have a lot of pivot to it, but that's fine because those dome switches allow you to get feedback as you're pressing every direction. And so this D-pad does pass the contra test. I'm able to press down on it, wiggle it left and right. The character doesn't move, but if I push it hard enough, I can make the character move, and I get that nice dome feedback as well. So yeah, I think this feels very good. And so when it comes to games like precision platformers, this is an excellent experience because I have all that really nice accuracy. Now, it doesn't have that same retro like rubber membrane feel to it, but I don't mind that either. So long story short, both the D-pad and the face buttons have a very precise clicky feel to them, and I do like that. Now these analog sticks are also kind of unique, so they have a wide range of motion. You can see I can move these sticks all around, and that's because they're using their more recent TMR joysticks. I've seen these in a couple other handhelds from them, and I really like them. These sticks themselves are very small. As you can see, there's a lot of space around them, and then also they don't stick out that much, so they don't stick out past the shell that allows us to close the screen. My favorite thing about these sticks is that they can actually pull off on the cap, and so you can see right here that they are almost a universal connection with other handhelds, things like the Retroid Pocket and Odin handhelds as well. And this means that we can swap them out for other options if we would like, maybe something a little bit wider or even taller. So here's a good example. On the left are the AYANEO flip caps, and on the right are the standard Retroid Pocket ones. And you can see that the ones on the right are quite a bit wider, but they're not that much taller. In fact, there's hardly a difference between the two. And so what I've been doing is just using my Retroid Pocket stick caps right here. They fit nicely and I can close the screen no problem, but they are a little bit wider in diameter. It's not a huge difference, but I would still call it an improvement. And you can find these sticks on the Retroid website for like $10. So yeah, there's a pretty good and easy way to make an upgrade. There are also 3D printed options out there, like these ones from Hype Sticks, and I'll leave these linked down below. You can get a bunch of these on Etsy. And so these are taller and also wider. And so you can see here, these are much bigger. They stick out quite a bit and give you a lot better feedback. And so if I'm going to be sitting down to play a first-person shooter game, I actually will sometimes swap it out for these sticks. Now, you cannot close the screen with these sticks. It's a little bit too tall. But when it comes to actual gameplay, this is great. So if you've got a bag or something, you can just throw these sticks in there and then put them on when you want them. So now let's talk about the million buttons that we have around here. So we have our select and start button, no surprise there. And then this one is called the dual screen button. This will allow you to bring up the bottom screen if it's turned off. I still have not been able to figure out what this button does. It doesn't really do anything, and there's no way to program it just yet in the software, so I'm not really sure about this one. This right here is our volume up and down. It's kind of a weird place, but it works well. And then this is our power button, which is also a fingerprint sensor, so you can log in that way. This right here is a little IR sensor you can use for your mouse nub if you need to navigate around windows. It also clicks down if you want to click there. On this side, we've got our AYANEO button. So this will bring up our quick menu, and then also this one will show your desktop. And we'll test all these out when we talk about software. On the bottom, we've got 2 stereo speakers and then a headphone jack, which works great, and then also a microphone input. On the back, we've got our fan intake and then 2 rubber grips, and these actually can come out, and so you can swap these out. In the bag, it'll come with 2 different other options. The one that comes on the handheld has this kind of dotted texture here, which is kind of subtle and hard plastic. I think it feels good. The other option that they give you is a little bit more ribbed looking. And personally, I like this texture better, so that's what I've been using. And it's very easy to swap between the two. It's also worth noting the plastic texture on this is pretty good. Now, I don't have a black model, which means that I can't really check for smudging and whatnot, but on this yellow model, I've had no problem whatsoever. That was one of my big problems with the original black model on the Flip DS, the fact that it got so smudgy. And so I do like the fact that the yellow one doesn't have this issue at all. Up top, we have our shoulders and triggers, and these actually feel pretty good. So we've got an analog input here with the trigger, and then we've got this soft click for the shoulder buttons, very easy to press down on. In terms of being able to place my fingers on them, I've had no issues even when at 180 degrees on this hinge. And yeah, I think that the triggers in general feel pretty good. They're a little bit shallow, and they just kind of pull towards the corners here, like they go towards the center more than anything. But still, I find it to be pretty comfortable. Also up top, like many other AYANEO devices, we've got these two programmable buttons. Now, in the software, again, we don't have anything to program these two just yet, so it's going to require a software update. We've also got our two USB-C ports, a charging indicator light, another microphone input, our micro SD card slot, and then also our exhaust vent for the fan. Now the hinge here is a 3DS style where it's centered and it is pretty strong. Like it can actually stay put in just about any location you put it, and it only clicks when you go all the way to 180 degrees. And so far I haven't had any issues with the hinge. It's been feeling really nice and sturdy and not too tight, not too loose. And for what it's worth, my Flip DS hinge never had any issues over the past year or so. It does have a little bit different of a feel because it actually clicks here, here, and then finally at 180 degrees. Whereas the new one just goes all the way back. So in general, I have been very impressed with the overall hardware look and feel of the AYANEO Flip 1S. It feels like a premium product. Okay, now let's talk about ergonomics, and there's some good and bad here. Number one is that it feels nice and well balanced. Like I mentioned before, it is bottom heavy, and so that heft just kind of resides in your palms. It's very impressive feeling. It also has some slight ergonomic bumps that are not enough for you to like full on grab, but I think it does enhance the overall feeling. I like this better than it being flat. And so what I generally will do is I will rest my index finger up top for the shoulders and triggers, then everything else just kind of rests below. A lot of the weight does kind of center right here in the middle of your palm, and so I think that's actually a pretty great place for it. Everything feels well balanced. However, there are 2 points to this that I don't think are perfect. Number one is the fact that this is a very sharp edge right here. It just kind of cuts off at a 90-degree angle, and you can definitely feel that against your palms as you're using it. So I kind of wish that this was a little bit more rounded, but otherwise I find it to be mostly comfortable. It's certainly not to the point of being painful in any way. I don't get like any marks on my hands, but it just feels a little bit sharper than I would like it to be. The other main point for me is that this is a very analog-centric device, not only because my thumbs just naturally rest right here, but moving my thumb down to match this D-pad, especially while you're in the middle of a game, is kind of uncomfortable. If you're just going to be playing a D-pad-centric game, it's not the end of the world because you can shift your hand down a little bit, and so this starts to feel a little bit more comfortable. But if you're mostly going to be playing like this, and then you got to move down to reach this one, I don't really like that. And honestly, a lot of this is just a trade-off of the fact that we have such a big screen here because there's nowhere for the D-pad to go inboard. Ideally, you want a V-shaped pattern where the analog stick and the D-pad are a little bit more inboard on the bottom, but unfortunately here, the screen takes up all that space. Now, even if you shift your hand down to use the D-pad like this, it's still a little bit less than ideal because all of this weight, which usually is going into your palm to help balance things, is now not there, and so it feels a little bit awkward. To give you an idea, even when playing a D-pad-centric game like a platformer, sometimes I will just opt to use the analog stick instead, even if it's not my preferred input method, just because it's more comfortable. Okay, now let's talk about these screens, and the top one here is very impressive. It is OLED, 1080p, 7 inches, and it can go up to 144 Hz, but generally I set it to 120. It's also a very bright screen. This is it at 100% brightness, and yeah, you can see it is blowing out my camera, which is a good sign. It can also get surprisingly dim. This is at the 0% brightness setting. You can see it barely shows up on camera. Again, a very good sign if you want to play this in a darker environment. Now the bottom screen is also not bad. You can see it's 4.5 inches. The bezels on this are a little bit wider than I would like, but in general it's still a fairly large screen. It can also get pretty bright, not as bright as the top screen, but this is it at 100% brightness, and yes, it's still pretty impressive. The lowest brightness does not get quite as dim, but it's also very easy to turn it off. We'll talk about that later in the settings too. So yeah, it doesn't have as much dynamic range as the top screen, but that kind of makes sense because you will mostly be using this bottom one as a secondary display anyway. So long story short, I think the top screen is excellent. It is nice and bright, very vibrant, nice color balance, and it also gets very bright to the point where you can play this outdoors no problem. The bottom screen is still very good on its own, but doesn't quite compare to the really high caliber of that top screen. In general, I would say that just the two together is a pretty nice combination. Okay, let's do a quick audio test here with the stereo speakers running Hades at about 80% volume. So right off the bat, you can probably hear that it has some pretty muffled audio. This has always been a complaint I've had with a lot of AYANEO handhelds, is that they cost a lot of money, but the audio is usually some of the worst that you find at this price point. Now, thankfully, because it's a Windows machine, there are lots of different tweaks and apps that you can use to adjust the audio and EQ it a little bit better. So my recommendation would be to go to the AYANEO Discord and see what everyone else is doing and see whether or not it works for you. But at least as it stands right out of the box, yeah, I'm not very impressed with this audio, especially at this price point. Okay, now let's talk about the software experience. I'm going to use a mouse here just so you can track what I'm doing a little bit more easily. But on the bottom here, you can see this is just kind of our standard layout. And this will give you quick access to a lot of different options. For example, you can adjust your TDP right here on the fly, and it can go all the way up to 30 watts. You can also monitor stuff like your fan speed, how much storage you have left, how much RAM is being used, and your CPU percentages as well. You've also got 3 different power profiles: extreme, balanced, and saving power. And if you go into the performance tab down below, you can make adjustments to them. For example, you can go into balanced and you can adjust the TDP to match that. And you can also change like your frames per second. There's a lot of different changes you can do here. One very important function is the CPU turbo toggle. When you're playing most PC games, you want to have this one turned off because it's not going to overuse the CPU. However, when using high-end emulation, things like PS3 and Nintendo Switch, you often will want to turn this on with the harder to run games because that will allow the games to run at full speed. So when it comes down to it, between these 3 profiles, you can kind of tweak them to whatever you would like to be. So for example, if you wanted the power saving one to be around maybe say 7 or 6 watts, you can set that. And then for the balanced one, you can make it a different profile, extreme, and so on. Also up top here, we've got some really handy functions. So this one here on the left will bring up an on-screen keyboard, and you've got a bunch of different options here. You can use, things like copy and paste, or just your regular keyboard function as well. On the center part here, we actually have a mouse pad option. So you click on this and that makes the entire bottom screen a mouse pad. And I actually find this to be really handy. I'm not a huge fan of this little IR nub. I found it to be just a little bit insensitive, but I found that using this bottom screen instead has been a little bit easier to use. To the far right of that, we've got this little light icon. This allows us to adjust the brightness of the bottom display, or you can just turn it off if you would like as well. So that's going to be great if you're only going to be using this screen, you want to save a little bit of battery life, and to bring it up, you would just press this button again. Further down in these bottom tab, we have the quick assistant. So just a bunch of quick rudimentary options that we can jump into. So for example, if you wanted to press the escape key really quickly, you can just do that here. You've also got an application tab and you can assign whatever you would like right here. You just press the add button and then find the apps that are installed and then choose them to be added. So this will be nice if you're trying to jump in and out of apps without having to see the actual desktop. Now the next tab is called Smart Dual Screen, and this will essentially scan the computer for any app that's open right now, and then you can choose to force the app to open on the bottom screen. So here with Google Chrome, if I tap on this, it's going to move it down here to the bottom. So I can hide this, and now I can just use this on this bottom screen and do something else up top. And you're going to use this tool a lot when it comes to playing things like dual screen games. We'll talk about that more later. Now you can also use just the regular iSpace app that they've had for years. So if you tap on that, it will bring up the iSpace here on the top. A lot of this is going to be redundant compared to what we can already do on the bottom here, but this is where you can adjust things like your TDP, your power profile, all those things that you would normally do on a single screen handheld. It does have some unique options like the ability to adjust the brightness on the top as opposed to the brightness on the bottom. This is also where you can go to adjust things like your analog trigger and joystick sensitivity and change out your ABXY profile. Also on the bottom, you can go into the system settings, so that'll bring up the full iSpace app. Yeah, there's like multiple different layers to this. And in this one, you can do the same thing where you can change out your profiles, make some new presets if you would like, and adjust how they behave. They've also got this new app called Snow Zone, and so this is supposed to allow you to suspend certain apps or keep them running. And so I've been messing with this a little bit and haven't really found a utility for it, but something to keep your eye on in the future when it comes to the iSpace software. And finally, probably the most important is that you can go down here and update the software. And they do this pretty frequently. Like every couple weeks, you'll see a new update here with iSpace, which will improve the overall software experience. Okay, now that we're familiar with the software experience, let's actually put it into practice and show how this works when it comes to playing games and other stuff. At the most rudimentary level, you would just use this as a regular PC up top, and then you would have your monitor showing here in the bottom. So this is going to work all automatically. So for example, you want to start up a game, you would just start it up here, and by default, it should go into your top screen. And so this is your most basic setup where you're just playing your games in your top screen, and then the bottom you have quick and easy access to be able to adjust your TDP or monitor your overall performance. So now let's say you want to use both screens at once in a productive way. So we've got our top display here with the emulation station, and then down below perhaps you want to open up a guide when you're playing a retro game. So let's start up a game. Let's go into the Super Nintendo section here. We'll start up something like Earthbound. Okay, so now I'm playing Earthbound, and maybe I'm stuck in the game and I want to actually get into a guide. So what I can do now is I can open up Google Chrome. Once I have that open, I can go over to the smart dual screen here and click on it, and it's going to open up here on the bottom. Now what I can do is I can minimize this bottom part and then go to whatever page I want. So for example, game FAQs. And so now I'm playing Earthbound, but then I also have the guide down below. In case I get stuck and I need to consult something, then I have the walkthrough right here while I'm still playing the game at the same time. So that's pretty cool. The nice thing about RetroArch in particular is when the app goes out of focus, it will automatically pause it. So when I tap on this one to read a little bit more, you can see that it paused the game, and then I can resume it by just tapping on it again. So that's pretty neat. Now you don't just have to have your games playing on the top screen, you can also move them down below and then play them here. A great example would be Game Boy Advance, because that's a 3:2 aspect ratio, which will perfectly match this screen. So here I am in RetroArch, and I'm going to go through here and I'm going to start up a Pokemon game here for Game Boy Advance. Now what I want to do is I want to move this display down here. So again, in the smart dual screen, I'm just going to click on that. It's going to move RetroArch down here. And so now I've got the game running here on the bottom, and it allows me to do whatever I would like up top. So for example, if I wanted to open up Google Chrome, maybe watch a YouTube video or, look at a guide or anything else like that, you can do two things at once. And I think that's pretty cool. So this will be really great for somebody who's maybe played a lot of Pokemon games in the past and they know exactly what they're doing here. They're just kind of going through the grind for fun. And so that allows you to do all sorts of other things on this top screen at the same time. So that's how it works when you're playing dual screen gaming, with gaming on one of the screens and doing something else on the other. But I think a lot of people are going to want to play dual screen games, and that's a little bit more complicated. There are only so many apps that will allow you to do this, and even then they have their own quirks. So I'm going to show you what I was able to figure out and a couple of the additional software tools that I had to use to really make the most out of it. Let's start with the Nintendo 3DS. This one's probably the easiest to wrap your head around. Now, by default, I used the Azahar emulator, and I found that this one actually was not a perfect fit. And that's because even once you have it running correctly, the games center to the left instead of in the center of the screen, and it can be a little bit distracting. And it's a shame because this is the app that probably runs 3DS games the best right now, but unfortunately, Azahar and its Azahar Plus fork both have the same behavior. So it's going to be a bit of a trade-off. If you want to have the best performance and the smoothest gameplay experience, then you're going to have your games kind of centered to the left. But if you use an older app like Lime 3DS, then this problem isn't there. So for this setup, I am going to use Lime 3DS just to kind of make it a little bit easier and get everything nice and centered. So in the settings, what you'll want to do is set it to single window mode, and under screen layout, you want to set it to separate windows. That means when you launch a game, you'll have your top and bottom screens showing up as different windows, and then we will just move them so the bottom screen is down below. So let's start with this game here, Rabbids Rumble. When I open it up, you're going to see two things happen. It's going to go into full screen, and you'll see another smaller window pop up just very briefly, but then it'll go under the main one. So as we click on it, you'll see that, it'll go full screen, and then a little one popped up, and then it went away. So what we want to do now is we want to get it to show up here on the bottom. And so we'll go back down to that dual screen setup. And now you can see we have two different options, and one says secondary, and that's going to be that secondary display. So let's click on that, and sure enough, we can now see the bottom screen here on the bottom. Now, one of the quirks of this setup is that this second screen will not actually go into full screen mode. So we have a toolbar up here on the top, and that can be a little bit distracting depending on the game that you're playing. And unfortunately, there's nothing in the AYANEO software that will force something into full screen. You've got to use a third-party app. The app we're going to use here is called Borderless Gaming. You used to be able to just download this directly, but now they actually require you to buy it on Steam. And so that's where I bought it. It was $7. And the way this works is super simple. You'll see all the apps running, and then you'll just pick your app and then click on it, and it'll force it to be in full screen. Now, the way you get it working on the AYANEO Flip requires a certain order, and it took me forever to figure this out, so let me walk you through it. So we're going to start up our app. It's going to be Lime 3DS this time around. Then we're going to pick our game, and we're going to launch it. Once the game is launched, if you remember, we'll have both of these screens up top because I haven't moved it down here on the bottom just yet. What we want to do now, before we move it down to the bottom, is we want to make it full screen. So now we need to open up borderless gaming. So I'm going to press on this button in the far right to get back to the desktop. And then I'm going to right click over here at the borderless gaming app that is running in the background. And I'm going to hit show. So now the app is up and I have all the different windows showing. And one of them says Rabid Rumble Secondary. So what I'm going to do now is I'm going to click on this one full screen button and just that's it. Now that I've clicked on that once, I just have to trust that it is running in full screen mode. What we want to do now is we want to go down here to the bottom, Smart Dual Screen. We want to refresh our list. And then we have our two options. And we've got that secondary screen again. So now I'm going to click on that. And there we go. We now have that secondary screen showing and we don't have that taskbar up above. And so this is how you can play your games. As you can imagine, that's a lot of work just to get one 3DS game working. You've got to launch the app. You've got to get the game running with all the correct parameters. You've got to open up the third-party app to take away the taskbar and then move the screen down below. And you've got to do that every single time you start up a 3DS game. And so it's not a seamless experience. So now let's do the same thing but with Wii U using the CMU app. So in this, you want to go into options and then there's an option that says separate gamepad view. So we're going to click that and make sure it's turned on. And so now let's start up a game. Let's do DuckTales Remastered. So we're going to click on this. It's going to start up the game and there's also going to be a second gamepad game playing as well. And this one has the same problem where the second screen will have the taskbar. So we need to use that borderless gaming again. So we're going to go back. We're going to open up the borderless gaming app one more time. And this time we got to find the app that says gamepad view and then make that one full screen. Once we've done that, we can now go up to options and select full screen. That's going to make the top screen full screen. And then down below on the smart dual screen, we want to click the one that says gamepad view and then open it up. And so there we go, we've now got the game running on both screens in two different windows. But DuckTales Remastered is probably not a great example because this one doesn't have any extra information on that second screen. It really just doubles what you're seeing on the top one. And it's going to be the same process when it comes to Nintendo DS using the Melon DS emulator. Now the setup for this one's a little bit different. You'll want to go into View and then you'll want to go into Screen Sizing. And you'll see one that says Top Only. You want to select that. Then there's one that says Open in New Window. It's going to open up an additional window. And when you have that window selected, you'll want to do the same thing. Go into View, Screen Sizing, and now make it Bottom Only. And so essentially this is what it's going to look like. Well, you have one screen that's up top and one up bottom. And so what you want to do at that point is just, you can either move the screen down to the bottom physically, or you can use that dual screen setup again. The problem with this one, even if you try to maximize it, is that you'll still have that toolbar, and using the borderless gaming does not get rid of it. So when you press this and you try to make it full screen, it just takes away one of the two menu bars, but you'll still have one. And I tried all sorts of tricks. People said if you open up a third window and put that over the first one, it's going to make everything full screen. But unfortunately, that hasn't been happening for me when I was testing it. And so the best that I could do when it came to regular DS was to use that borderless gaming again, but it only takes away half of this menu bar. And so you'll see in the footage later on when we do emulation testing that unfortunately you have to see that taskbar the whole time, and I wasn't able to figure out a fix. Now, one other thing worth noting is that we can use additional apps to include gyroscope for our emulation. That's going to help when it comes to Wii U and Nintendo Switch. For this, we're going to use an app called Handheld Companion, which essentially forces this to behave like a PlayStation 4 controller. Once you have that app installed, in the controller section under controller type, you want to change it to emulated DualShock 4 controller. From there, the built-in controls you want to hide. So now all these inputs are going to behave like a DualShock 4 controller, and then we have to go into the emulator and basically set it up for that. So under the CMU emulator options, we'll go into emulated control, and under controller, we're going to change that to a PS4 controller. And that's going to allow us to basically have those inputs along with gyro. You'll also need to go into the settings here under the controller, and there's a use motion option, so turn that on as well. Once you have that set up, that's it. This device will now work with gyroscopic controls and do the same thing with your Switch emulator, and you'll be good to go. And some Wii U games will require you to have gyro input, like Star Fox Zero. So this is a really important factor. It makes it so that you can move your reticle around. Okay, so now that we have a pretty good understanding of how to finagle all this stuff to get the dual screen gaming working, let's actually just do some gameplay performance testing now and see what you can expect. There are essentially going to be three different ways that you can play this device. There's the standard handheld mode. So this is where you're going to play your PC and emulated games, and you can adjust your performance profiles as needed to help you save battery life. Another nice feature of this handheld is that it kind of works like a small laptop, and so you can kind of play it in desktop mode as well. That means you could maybe plug it in and then have the screen tilted towards you and then connect it with a Bluetooth controller and play this way as well. And then finally, you could also just use this as a computer. So you could dock it into, say, for example, a larger monitor and then play it like this. This would allow you to basically push the performance as high as you want and just use it like a regular old computer that also happens to look like a 3DS. So in all this testing, we're going to do it in handheld mode. And so I am going to be mindful of my performance profiles and what exactly we can expect when it comes to battery life. And we're going to do more in-depth testing with battery life here later in the video, but for now, when I'm showing off all these PC games, on the bottom right, you can see the expected battery life with each of these games. When it comes to these lightweight games, you can play these at full speed, no problem, and the battery life will hover around maybe 3 to 3.5 hours. That does seem a little bit low for a 45 watt-hour handheld PC, but also bear in mind that you are driving 2 screens at once during all of this testing. Once you get away from those really lightweight games and start moving into something a little bit more demanding, then it is going to tax the battery a little bit more. So for something like an Xbox 360 era game like BioShock Infinite, this is where I would expect to get about 2.5 hours of battery life. Same thing with maybe a little bit more mid-range RPG games like Octopath Traveler 2. For these types of games, I would expect maybe like a 10 watt TDP performance profile, which is why you're going to get about that 2.5 hours of gameplay. I found that the sweet spot for the HX370 has been around a 12 watt TDP profile. That allows me to play, kind of more mid-range modern games, things like Whisker Squadron Survivor or Stray. These are somewhat demanding games, but they run great at a 12 watt TDP. But, those 12 watts are going to demand more power. And so I would expect somewhere between like 2 hours or maybe an hour and 45 minutes here. When it comes to playing more high-end games, things like Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, then I found that the sweet spot for me here is usually around a 15 watt TDP, but you have to make some adjustments to make it playable at that level. So for example, with this game, I played it at 1080p low settings and then turned on FSR at the quality preset and then used it at a 30 frames per second cap. And that gives me a pretty smooth gameplay experience. And so that's what I would expect when you start getting closer to that AAA experience, is probably dropping it down to 30 frames per second to be able to save on battery life. And yeah, expecting somewhere between like an hour and a half and an hour and 15 minutes altogether, depending on what TDP you're using, usually around the 15 watt mark. If you're willing to make additional adjustments, for example, Elden Ring here running at 720p low settings, so I drop the resolution, and that allows me to play this game at around 12 watts instead, so I can get closer to 2 hours of gameplay. So you really have to pick and choose how much battery you have left and how much time you have to play, and then kind of find a balance there. If you're really just trying to push the performance as much as you can, then you can definitely do that too, but you will pay for it in battery life. So here with Cyberpunk 2077, I got 1 hour and 11 minutes running this at basically full speed. So this is capping out near a 30 watt TDP, but giving me an average about maybe 40 frames per second, which is pretty nice. And I'm running this at 1080p with a Steam Deck preset. I think it looks pretty good on a 7-inch display. So when it comes to PC gaming, I think there's plenty of performance power here, but the battery life just isn't quite there. And I think it's because we've got a 45 watt hour battery, and that's not that big, especially with the more demanding games. And we've got 2 screens running at once. You can turn off one of those screens. We'll talk about that later when we do battery life testing, but even then, it just feels like this thing is taking a lot of battery life away. So let's move on to emulation. We'll talk about probably the systems you'll play the most on a dual screen handheld, which will be dual screen games. And then we'll also talk about, the other stuff after that. For a regular Nintendo DS, I used Melon DS at a 4x resolution, and everything played great in terms of performance and just everything looking nice, other than that taskbar that I couldn't get rid of. And it is really fun to be able to see both screens at once. And I think between the two systems, the Nintendo DS did a better job of using both screens compared to the 3DS. So there is going to be a large amount of the catalog, which is going to just feel a lot better than trying to play it on a single screen. Now with all these emulators, you can also use the second screen at the same time, which is really awesome, especially when playing DS and 3DS. But I will admit that the touchscreen experience doesn't quite feel the same as it did originally. A lot of that has to do with the fact that these new touchscreens are capacitive touchscreen as opposed to the actual pressure touchscreens that we had on the DS and 3DS. And so because the screen doesn't have that little bit of pressure give, it just doesn't feel as tactile as it did previously. So that's something to bear in mind, is that it still kind of feels like a very emulated experience in general, especially when playing some of these touchscreen DS games. Not only do we have those white taskbars up top, which can be a little bit distracting, but then also, just pressing on this doesn't feel the same as using a stylus. They've got those rubber nub styluses, but even then, it probably isn't going to feel the same. I think the perfect example here is going to be Nintendogs because, this is supposed to mimic like petting a dog. And yes, using a stylus back in the day wasn't the same, but there was a little bit of a charm to it back then. And I'm not feeling that same charm when I'm just rubbing on a glass screen. It does not feel like I'm petting this beautiful beagle puppy. So something to be mindful of is that sometimes these games look better than they actually feel. To be honest, I had a much better time playing Nintendo 3DS games than I did original DS games, and there's many reasons for it. Number one, we can also upscale these games to a 4x resolution, and they look a lot more crisp and clear compared to the original DS, just because, these were made with better graphics in mind. Not only that, the Nintendo 3DS had a wider screen up top like we do here on the AYANEO Flip, and so it's just a more natural fit when playing these at the correct aspect ratio. This app also doesn't have to deal with that pesky taskbar issue as long as you go through that borderless gaming app. And then finally, it just doesn't use the touchscreen as much, and so you spend a lot of your time focusing on that top screen, which looks amazing, and then you can use the bottom screen as needed to, change a power up or whatever. And so I would say that the 3DS is the one emulated system on this AYANEO Flip that truly feels like an otherworld experience. Like this is 4x resolution of the original 3DS, and this is where I can see it really being a good value. If you love this catalog in particular and you don't mind dealing with the hiccups that come with emulation, this can be a lot of fun. And then finally, our last system that really took advantage of this dual screen setup was Nintendo Wii U, for better or for worse. Like with these other ones, there is some good and bad with it. And the good is the fact that this is a handheld PC, and the CEMU emulator has been worked on Windows for many years. And so many of these games are going to run really well. And the chipset obviously has plenty of power to be able to play all these games too. And so it's just a really fun experience to be able to play these games. Now the bad is that many Wii U games, I would say the majority of them, really didn't take advantage of that second screen option, and so often it'll just mirror your content. And so you probably don't want to set up like this unless you prefer to see two things happening at once, because this is going to drain your battery that much faster. Now thankfully there are a good amount of games that will take advantage of that second screen. Most of the time it's just to show you like a menu or a mini map, but it's a welcome change compared to just doubling what you see on the top screen. So you may have to be choosy about which games to play with the two-screen setup, but when it works, it really works, and it's really fun to use. For me, the best example has always been Star Fox Zero, because this is a game that requires you to use two screens at once. And on the original Wii U, I know a lot of people didn't really like this setup because it required you to look at the gamepad in your hand, but then also look up and look at the TV, and so that was a little distracting. And so there are definitely games that will benefit with this kind of two-screen setup and might actually be better than the original hardware. Now moving on to all the other emulations, this is mostly going to be a foregone conclusion that it just behaves like you would expect, but you have that second screen to be able to monitor performance or maybe watch a YouTube video and so on. Now because we've got 120 Hz refresh rate on that top screen and a bunch of performance power, we can really take advantage of that when it comes to retro gaming. So we can do things like the CRT Beam Simulator shader, which is going to give us better motion clarity, and then also combine that with like a CRT Royale shader to make it look like an old school CRT television. And so yeah, we've got a lot of options here if you want to try it out. And then at the very top end, because this is a powerful chipset, we can emulate all the high-end stuff as well, and that's going to include stuff like, Nintendo Switch, as well as PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360. When it comes to these higher end emulators, you will have to toggle on that CPU turbo boost that we talked about in the software section, but otherwise most of these will be plug and play. It's really going to come down to emulation compatibility, and as long as the game is going to run on this chipset and, runs well in the emulator, you should have a really good time here. And even though these are single screen games, it is still nice to have that second screen down below to be able to quickly adjust things like your TDP, or to be able to quickly see, how many frames per second are going on without having to take away from that full screen experience up top. And so long story short, yes, you can play just about everything on this with some minor limitations when it comes to emulation compatibility, and then also keep your eye on that battery because it can drain pretty quickly. Speaking of which, let's talk about battery here, and I did two different tests, first with PC games and then with emulation. On the top right, you can see that I did everything with 50% brightness, 50% volume, and then obviously I used the AI-HX370 for my testing. It is worth noting that time to charge is about an hour and a half, 0 to 100%, so it doesn't charge super quickly. Looking at PC gaming first, on the far right, let's talk about Celeste. So this game can run basically on a potato. So a 4-watt TDP at a 1080p resolution and a locked frame rate of 60 frames per second. Now I did this test twice with this game. The first time I played it with these two screens showing up. So I had the bottom screen to monitor performance and then the top screen to play the game. That gave me 3 hours and 45 minutes, but when I turned off the bottom screen, it gave me an additional 20 minutes of gameplay. Now, all things considered, when we're talking about close to 4 hours, an additional 20 minutes may or may not be worth it for you, but that's about what I would expect when it comes to playing with both screens on once. You will have better battery life if you turn that bottom one off. For the other games, I did play it with two screens at once so you can get an idea of what to expect. So in this second category with BioShock Infinite, I ran this at a 10-watt TDP, got 1080p low settings, frame rate of 60 frames per second locked. And this one I got exactly 2 hours and 30 minutes of battery life. Pushing that up a little bit higher to Ratchet & Clank Rift Apart, 15-watt TDP here, 1080p low settings with FSR quality turned on, frame rate 30 frames per second just capped in the software, and this time I got about an hour and a half of gameplay. Meanwhile, with Spider-Man, I pushed it up to a 20-watt TDP because I really didn't see any benefit beyond 20 watts in terms of FPS, and the average here was 40 frames per second. Again, 1080p low settings with FSR quality turned on, and I got 1 hour and 15 minutes of gameplay. So in general, this is what I would expect when it comes to PC gaming. I would expect anywhere between, 4 hours with the really lightweight stuff and turning off that second display, and then as little as an hour and 15 minutes if you want to push that performance and have a really nice gaming experience. Moving over to emulation, it's going to be a pretty similar experience, but I wanted to focus on the stuff that you probably would play on this device in the first place. We'll start with Earthbound on the Super Nintendo, and this is my example of when you're like pulling up a guide at the same time. Now, if I just turn off the screen and I play it at 60 Hz refresh rate, I got 4.5 hours of gameplay. If I wanted to have things like black frame insertion, which requires 120 Hz, and also the second screen turned on, that did reduce the battery life quite a bit. So this time I got 3 hours and 55 minutes. So again, we're looking at a difference of about a half hour between these two, but still an average of about 4 hours when playing really lightweight stuff. Now the nice thing is that DS and Nintendo DS, even playing at a 4x resolution, gave me an average of about 3 hours of battery life. So a little bit over 3 hours when playing Mario Kart DS, and a little bit under 3 hours when playing Mario & Luigi Bowser's Inside Story. For Nintendo Wii U, I tried a bit more of a demanding game, so I did Twilight Princess. This one plays at a 1080p resolution, and then also I used that second screen playing at the same time, and this time I got in about an hour and 20 minutes altogether. So again, kind of like that high-end PC gaming performance. And so, yeah, this again looks like a pretty similar spread to what we were seeing on the PC side in terms of, yes, 4 hours on the low end, and then, about an hour and 15 minutes on that high end. Okay, we spent a lot of time talking about this handheld. Let's now wrap up and talk about what I like and what I don't like about it. Number one, I really like how beautiful this device is, especially this yellow and black color model. I think it really pops and looks so much better than the original one, especially because we have that bigger screen on the bottom. And the screen upgrade really does make a nice difference because it makes the bottom screen a lot more usable. They've also done a lot of updates to the software. For example, that on-screen keyboard or the on-screen touchpad, none of that stuff worked on the original Flip, but they do now. I also am a fan of these sticks. They are small, but I love the fact that they are replaceable, so I'm able to swap it out with different caps depending on the game that I'm playing. And so I hope they continue to use these smaller sticks because I think that they just give us a lot more options. It's also fun to mess around with whatever possibilities you can with a dual screen setup. And so I've really enjoyed just kind of brainstorming how am I going to use two screens at once when playing a game. The performance on the HX370 is also really good because it's basically good enough to play everything you can throw at it. You're going to have to make some compromises here and there between resolution and frame rate, but it's still pretty cool to be able to throw just about anything you can onto this device and be able to play it. Now, you knew this was coming, but there are things I don't like about it. And number one has to be that battery life. It's been a while since I've actively looked at a battery so often when playing a game. I think the presence of having two screens here and the fact that it's only a 45 watt-hour battery in the first place really is a bad combination because this thing drains a lot faster than I would like. It is frustrating to sit down to play a game and then check the battery after maybe 20 minutes and be like, how have I lost that much battery life in just 20 minutes? But that happens very often. It's also worth noting that you will spend a lot of time not playing games and instead fighting Windows to get this dual screen setup going. I showed a few examples where I was able to get it working, but what I didn't show is the 2 weeks of frustration that I had in testing to try to get this equilibrium kind of figured out. And so if you're the type of person who doesn't like wrestling with Windows, I can say that adding a second screen on a small device like this is going to make you spend more time in the menus than you may like. For my third point, I didn't really know where to talk about this, so I left it for the end, but this device does get quite warm as you're using it. The original Flip had the same problem. It's not to the point where I would consider it to be hot, but it is noticeable. And so if you're the type of person like me, where you don't like your handhelds to get warm in your hands, then this one is definitely going to get warm. I also was not a fan of the ergonomics when using the D-pad in particular. I think everything else is relatively comfortable, but that D-pad just feels uncomfortable because it's so low and it's not inset into the device because the screen is in the way. And so like I mentioned in the ergonomics section, there are times when I play D-pad centric games but with an analog stick instead, just because it was more comfortable. And then finally, as of right now and what we're seeing on Indiegogo, this is 100% a luxury price tag. The 8840U version would have been a much more affordable option. It started at $800, which I think is pretty reasonable for what you're getting here. But as of making this video, they have a shortage of those motherboards, which means that they're not even offering them up for sale. And so the starting price right now is $1,300 for the HX370, which is a lot more expensive as a CPU. And I think that price point makes it unobtainable for everybody except for those who are looking for a luxury handheld. To put it another way, after 2 weeks of messing around with this device, at the $800 price point, I would be tempted to buy the 8840U. But at $1,300 for the HX370, I am not seeing that price point making sense for me. Now, of course, this is all subjective, and maybe you don't mind spending 3 times the price of a base Steam Deck to get something that is basically the ultimate Nintendo 3DS machine. And so it's all going to really come down to you and what you prioritize. If you've been waiting forever for a 2-screen handheld, and then I'm here to say that yes, this thing is pretty awesome. The fact that you've got an OLED display up top that can go to 120 Hertz, you've got enough power to be able to play everything, this is all really cool. And there are so many things that you can do on a 2-screen PC like this, especially within Windows. It just gives you a lot of options to work with, and if you don't mind tinkering around and messing with third-party apps and whatnot, this is a lot of fun to play. But I think for everybody else, it might be worth just waiting and seeing if maybe they offer the 8840U option again in the future, and also the Pocket DS, which is that Android-based version, might be worth waiting for as well in terms of price point and what you'll be able to play on it too. So let me know what you think in the comments down below. I've had a lot of fun testing this device, but like I said, at this price point, it's not something that I would personally buy. As always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.